In the 1850s, Americans in northern states were debating the morality of slavery. Many knew little more about the subject than what they'd heard from slave owners or read in Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1855, abolitionist Charles Sumner introduced a little reality to the discussion when he introduced the New York Times editors to a young, recently freed slave. Her name was Mary Botts, and she looked nothing like the enslaved people illustrated in magazines. The Times described her as so white as to defy the acutest judge to detect in her features, complexion, hair, or general appearance the slightest trace of Negro blood. A lot of Northerners imagined slavery was like the pictures they saw in magazines, men and women with African features laboring in fields. The image of Miss Botts, shown here with her brother, challenged their view. Here was a child not unlike their own, who'd been bought and sold as the property of slave owners. This widely reproduced image was one of the first examples of abolitionists using photography to confront the realities of slavery. The fact that Northerners responded more strongly to a picture of a slave who looked white reflected a deep-seated racism in the North. Many Northerners, even as they were fighting a war to win slaves' freedom, still saw them as subhumans. 8 years after Mary Botts' photo captured people's attention, an even more unsettling photo was widely circulated. It showed an escaped slave, Peter, who had been whipped so badly he had nearly died. Americans were horrified when they saw the photo reproduced in the country's most popular magazine, Harper's Weekly. The picture of whipped Peter, as he came to be known, dispelled the myth of the humanely treated slaves that slave owners had created. Public opinion was further outraged a year later, when abolitionists again employed the power of photography to change people's thinking. Northerners working in Louisiana sent a group of 7 freed slaves on a tour of New England to raise money to educate liberated African Americans. The tour was also intended to let Northerners see the people they were fighting to free. Members of the group, whose photo was also reproduced in Harper's Magazine, were selected for the greatest impact on Northerners. There was Wilson Chin, for example. He was photographed wearing a punishment collar used on slaves. The large initials of his former master, branded into his forehead, testified to the atrocities perpetrated on enslaved people. But the greater impact was made by 4 children with distinctly European features. These photo cards of what were called white slaves were widely sold and exchanged throughout the North. They challenged Northerners to broaden their thinking about slavery, to realize that it meant more than black American adults. It meant that even children with obvious European features weren't spared enslavement. Harper's Magazine described the slave children as the offspring of white fathers through 2 or 3 generations. It alluded to an issue that slave owners were reluctant to discuss: the sexual exploitation of slave women. Mary Chestnut, married to a South Carolina senator, compared slave owners to old-time patriarchs who lived with their wives, concubines, and mixed-race children in the same house. Southern ladies, she said, could name the white father of every mixed-race child in other households, but those in her own she seems to think just dropped from the clouds. White Americans might not have identified with black slaves, but photos such as the one of a freed young girl named Rebecca made the issue difficult to dismiss, especially when they reflected that someday she too could be sexually exploited by a slave owner. Photography was still relatively young in the 1860s, but even then, as today, it revealed the ugly truths about America's inequality and brutality and the power to inspire change. This video was brought to you by the Saturday Evening Post Digital Archives. Saturday Evening Post members can explore our 200-year-old archive and receive 6 issues of the Post print edition for only $15 a year. Subscribe today at the link below.